Have you ever thought what it is like to be a filmmaker, water and breakfast nerd all in one? Or what about using entertainment, fun and social media to tell a connected story about pressing world issues? With a laundry list of grand challenges, we are all called upon each and every day to think of out-of-the-box ways to make our world a more sustainable place. This show is about inspiring individuals and their journey along the cutting edges of science, engineering, technology and design. I'm your host, Peter Marcus Bach, and this is the Grand Challenges Podcast. My guest today is Anas Ghadouani, Professor in Environmental Engineering from Aquatic Ecology and Ecosystem Studies at the University of Western Australia. Anas has over 20 years in research and teaching experience, from limnologist to a passionate and interdisciplinary storyteller around the Sustainable Development Goals. He is also the co-host of his own podcast, What Are You On About? In today's show, we uncover how Anas's multiple passions have shaped his unique and entertaining teaching and communication style around the environment and the power of bringing fun into your work. For more information, refer to the show notes at petermbach.com/podcast. Thank you for joining and please enjoy the show. Anas Ghadouani, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Pete. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. First time in 3 years. When was the last time we saw each other?
Yeah, probably 3 years.
Yeah, we had dinner in Melbourne 3 years ago, I remember.
Correct, yeah.
And that was a nice catch up. You happened to be there as I was packing up things in Melbourne to move to Switzerland.
Correct. It is true.
Yeah.
Yeah, time flies.
Time flies, indeed. And now I'm back here.
Yeah.
And
with the podcast, exciting.
With the podcast, indeed. It's been a very fun project and very pleased to have you on the show today.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think there's one little interesting anecdote I got from your partner in crime, Leah, who will also be on the show in the next episode, in fact. And that was that apparently you almost went into filming or filmmaking.
Oh, yeah, actually, yeah. I almost had a career in movie making. So literally what happens is when I was at the university, I was like, my side job, so to speak, is how do you say in Australia, side hustle? My side hustle was to work in movie production. And I just, got involved in it and met lots of good friends and learned with lots of people. And at some stage, I became really good at it. So, at some stage when I announced to people that I was going to do postgraduate studies and do a PhD, and everyone was shocked because I was actually on radio. I was doing all the things. No, that stays with me because I think it's one of those things that, once you have a passion for something. But the good thing is you can bring it all together through research.
Indeed.
At the end of the day, it's all about storytelling.
Indeed, that is very true. And you do that very actively now. And in fact, you did a Bachelor of Science and then went on to do a PhD in Montreal in limnology.
Yep.
And now in Australia doing stuff in environmental engineering, in aquatic ecology.
So it's really interesting because there are not many people who study limnology, and that, as you can see on my door, it's still a bumper sticker that one of my colleagues from Oslo, which is the American Society of Limnology and Oceanography, but now the Aquatic Society of Limnology and Oceanography. This is sort of a society that I grew up in as a student with their annual conference, etc. So it grew from being a North American society into an international society. It was kind of international, but it's more international now. And he made up these bumper stickers that says, "Have you hugged the limnologist today?" And it explains what limnology, because most people think in if you go to morning tea or an afternoon tea or a barbecue and say to people limnology, they go like immunology. So you had to explain to people that it is really from the Greek limnos, which is the lake and study in lakes. So I'm a sort of an expert in lakes, small and large. I worked on the Great Lakes, small lakes, experimented with lakes, did whole lake studies or whatever. So everything. When I moved to Australia, one of my actually professors who supported me for the position at UWA said to me, "Why are you moving to Australia? They don't have any lakes." And I was like, and he says, "You can barely find any water there. You may be able to squeeze the rock out of some water, but that's about it." And that was really interesting because, limnology really doesn't stop at necessarily the study of lakes, but to me, it's the interplay between the physics, the chemistry, and the biology within a certain domain. And that's really very transferable.
Indeed.
So then from there, I started working on all sorts of water systems. And I ended up in sort of environmental engineering, doing wastewater, doing urban water, doing all sorts of things. So, I think at the end of the day, first principles.
True.
Yeah.
If you learn the basics of the foundational knowledge, you can apply it to anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess how we got onto here, you decided to go for postgraduate studies, I guess abandoning, but not really abandoning the filmmaking passion, because now you're actually very active.
Yeah, absolutely. I am. And I think really interesting was, how I got there is that, I grew up in Morocco. So I did my Bachelor of Science in Morocco. And one of my last actually oral exams, so over there is a sort of European system. So you pass the written exam and you have to pass the oral exam as well. So I went into this professor's office and he gave me actually a question about lakes. And I was so interested at the time and I just apparently nailed it. He said to me, this was the best exam that I've ever had in my career. You should do something about it. That's what he told me at the time. And I was like, boom, where do you study lakes? You go to Canada because that's where, there's all lakes. There's millions and millions of lakes. And I went about it that way. So it was like the discovery. And it was really, really very eye-opening.
And Canada, as you quote, owns a lot of water in the world, but we'll get to that in a minute. Yeah. Definitely a very interesting, I guess, moment where, when you're told something or you're encouraged to do something, you somehow pursue it, and then it just opens up a whole new world for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a new world that you didn't know existed even. And you go like, really? Is that fascinating? So
it seems like you've been always interested in storytelling. I guess you went into the scientific realm because in a way there's a technicality there, but storytelling never really left you.
It's really important because I think culturally speaking, so I come from a tradition of storytelling. So, culturally, we're brought up in Morocco around storytellers. So most of the time, people either eat or plan the next meal or talk about food, or they sit and they are listening to someone tell a story.
About food.
Probably about food.
Probably about food.
So storytelling is part of our everyday life. And it's fascinating how it's so valued in society that, it's really big part. So I grew up around storytellers and I just listened to people telling all sorts of stories, from the simple stories all the way to the very elaborate academic. So obviously I come from an academic background in terms of family, and I had people come into my house, professors, but I was growing up as a child. I didn't know. They were just like friends passing by, my dad's friends or family members. And then people sit around them and they're talking about stuff. And I'm there as well. And they include me in the conversations, even stuff that's really high level. And I was like, wow, this is fascinating. So I always was intrigued by storytelling and how people can connect in different ages and different... Perhaps the turning moment was one of my professors in Montreal, actually, Deep Saini, who's now just became the president of McGill University, very, very dear friend of mine and mentor. I was going to go to my first international conference. And I was so scared because my paper had been accepted. As you know, the drill, you're a graduate student, your paper gets accepted, and you go to this conference and they're going to be 300 people and you're going to walk in and speak to them. So I went to Deep and I said, hey, Deep, what do you think? What's your advice to me? And he says, Anas, people have no reason to listen to you. And he walked away.
Huh?
There is no a priori reason why people would listen to you.
Wow.
And then walked away. And I was like, this is really interesting. And then I called him up and I was like, what do you mean? And he says, except if you make them.
The art and craft.
He's a man of very, very elaborate statements. And that stayed with me. In fact, I tell my students till this day. So the invitation for him was like, well, you can present data, you can present science. And there will be lots of people doing that. So how can you make people listen to you? And that's really the journey that I've been on for so many years, more than 20 years now.
And I see a lot of familiarity in my own journey because I think when I just finished my undergrad and I was doing my postgraduate studies, that was also around the time I think TED Talks became the thing. And you yourself have been on a TED Talk on a topic that was super interesting. But it really was an interesting example of how you can capture an audience in a complex topic.
Yeah.
And this was something that I really wanted to then explore in my own research. So I think, you will get these moments and it makes you really want to then create and then be creative in your own way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you do it well, Pete, by the way, because
thank
I
you.
really admire the way that, technically, I think that even the outputs, the products that you've been really famous for are around this idea of making it accessible. There are lots of people who can understand how to code and so many people who can do coding very well, but not many people can do that. So I think to make it accessible, you don't have to code to understand how to read those models or how to use those models. And I think socializing things that are technically complex with general audience is really fascinating one. And you've done really well in that space. I think it's about the idea that there's more than one reason why we do science. And if we keep exploring and we keep trying to understand who the audience is, then, that becomes a natural journey. But it is something that is on my mind every time because I speak to, one of my favorite things is sometimes I speak to even senior citizens and I have people doing stand-up ovation because I kind of relate to some of the things that I just speak to what people are interested in. And I usually ask people if they invite me for a presentation or anything, I say, what's the three things that people who are going to come are thinking about on that day? And people tell me, and you can tailor this to a conversation. Like someone will come to dinner at your house and you find a common topic to talk about. You don't just talk at them. You have to kind of make it relatable. And I think if scientists and researchers do more of this, I think the world will be a better place.
I definitely agree. And thank you for your kind words for that. I think it's very important that we as scientists make that knowledge accessible. Sometimes we do have to take the complex topic and simplify it in the form of tools. Yeah. But other times, I think it's really about getting the people to see that complexity.
Yeah.
You yourself, you do the exact same, I think, with the way you communicate. And in some of the big research organizations we have been in, such as the Cooperative Research Center for Water Sensitive Cities that has been running for
10 years plus.
A 10-year program from 2011 or 12 onwards. You've been also very active in promoting that and promoting some of the research coming out of it.
Absolutely. I think what's really interesting about transdisciplinary programs is that actually, lots of people will say, well, we just do something, but it's really hard to do multidisciplinarity very well. And it does require that we are open-minded and that we are generous in how we hold our perception of things or our perspective. So one of my favorite saying is that people sometimes hold their convictions a little bit too tightly. And the best thing comes when they hold them a little lighter. So hold your conviction lightly because there is always new evidence. There's always a different perspective. And I think when we get people in a multidisciplinary scene, it's sometimes almost comical how people use the same words to describe very different things. And that's the starting point, is common language.
Indeed, I definitely agree. I think in relation to your saying, one of the other quotes I've heard, it's a bit more, I guess, graphic, but it's shooting your babies.
Yeah.
People don't like to often shoot their babies, with babies being the research. So
Yeah.
We're not talking about the literal humans here.
Yeah, I know. And also they don't like to open up too quickly. And one of my favorite analogies is, how I got some of the research to be a little bit more collaborative over the years. It takes time. I mean, collaboration is not easy as well to achieve. It's very, very expensive to run collaborative arrangements. That's why not many organizations fund collaborative arrangement. But one of the things is that people are not really comfortable opening almost their kitchen while they're cooking. So, and I say to people, you need to be, if you just invite people and serve them a meal that you cooked yesterday and your kitchen is particularly clean, which is not the way. I love cooking, by the way, but it's not the way.
I was going to say, you're using the kitchen example here. You love your food.
My kitchen is all over the place. And if you come to my house, you're going to see me cooking. And you're going to maybe participate in some of the cooking. And that's a way of showing almost your vulnerability. And researchers don't like to do that. They want to give you something that they are certain of. Now, what it does is that you don't include people early on. So, I encourage people to open their kitchen and then cook together, because there is a joy in cooking. There is a joy in making mistakes. There is joy in something, in a glass falling on the ground and breaking, and you solve that problem right there.
And experimentation.
The experimentation. And I think that's one of my favorite analogies, actually. And it does resonate with lots of people. Go like, what's the worst case scenario? You burn the turkey, as they say, and you order pizza.
Yeah. That is true.
But you are together and you will remember that moment. Like people want to be too low risk, so to speak. And I think research is about taking the risk together and sharing those risks. And I think that's really the secret.
I think the risk aversion is not just prevalent in the research, but also in the broader industry. I've seen it quite a lot in the water industry
100%.
in the last few years.
100%.
Last decades even.
Yeah, 100%.
But I think it's a very nice little illustration and also a good picture to take with you, that it's really about that collaboration, because you've been big on that.
Absolutely.
And I guess before we get to that, taking a bit of a step back, one area that you have been very strong in is in the area of, you mentioned lakes already as a limnologist. So I'll make sure I hug a limnologist today.
Yeah. That's right.
But also on the topic of cyanobacteria and algal blooms, which is also pretty prevalent across the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was one of my first things that I actually started working on initially, and it took me kind of around the world. I was that part of it, did some work at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, where they have lakes as well, but they have a fabulous institute there. I was in Alberta, Canada. I was on the Great Lakes. I was literally chasing all the cyanobacteria. That was the time where cyanobacteria in some places, particularly in the Canadian Shield, weren't really seen. They were like very, very low nutrient lakes. And I even had people who challenged me. It says, this is not a problem for the Canadian Shield because our lakes are post-glacial lakes and they are low in nutrients. Well, guess what? The world suddenly moved around and there was so many algal blooms in systems that people haven't predicted in the past. So it's fascinating how cyanobacteria has been around for more than 3.9 billion years. And people still second guess them.
Yeah, maybe just a 101 for listeners. So cyanobacteria, these are the bacteria that cause the algal growth.
Yeah.
So they get the energy through photosynthesis.
Correct. So they are probably the first known photosynthetic organisms by far, because there is evidence in rocks, there's evidence. So we trace them back. In Australia, there's like trombolites and stromatolites that are sort of modern representation of the ancient form, the early form of what these organisms initially were not really super advanced, because they are prokaryotic. They don't have a formed nucleus, so to speak, in the cell. But at the same time, they were responsible for some of the most spectacular events in the history of the planet. So one that I refer to as the biggest release of a toxic gas in the history of the planet was when cyanobacteria was developing, and that's oxygen. Because, oxygen is a toxic gas in certain proportions. And at some stage, there was so much oxygen that came out of, and that was spectacular. And then from there was lots of geological events or whatever. But cyanobacteria they have been fascinating. Obviously there are problems with their toxicity and odor and taste in water, and they have been around for so many years. I think generally speaking, we're kind of dealing with them okay, but from time to time, they just show us these blooms that are spectacular, where the whole place turns into a green soup and you have to kind of wait. So in Australia, we see more often some of these issues, and they're still really a problem.
I think one of the famous ones that caught media attention occurred in China a few years before or months before the Beijing Olympics.
Yeah,
right?
I know.
And when these things happen, I mean, I guess from the environmental side, you get a serious decline in oxygen in the lakes. And so the life there, the fish will start dying and it's just uninhabitable.
Absolutely.
But then from the human perspective, when we have these, I mean, it looks ugly and toxic on the one hand, but I guess swimming in them, not recommended.
Not recommended because the odor and everything. But, luckily, I mean, these events tend to be sporadic. There are some systems that have them more often. I mean, like even systems that are naturally very sort of salty that have become like the Baltic Sea, for example, in Europe, where, it's one of the seas that develop actually cyanobacteria blooms over the years because of the pollution. So, we've seen some mini system, large lakes as well, develop in our works on Lake Erie at the height of cyanobacteria issues, because they were like linked to the introduction of invasive species like zebra mussels that modified the system, changed the nutrient dynamic, and created lots of spectacular algal blooms. So luckily, we still have the ability to kind of deal with them, treatment, but we try not to go to the level of treatment. We've done lots of work on how to control cyanobacteria on a small scale. So it is possible, but large scale, it's a no-brainer. It's about the nutrients control in the catchment in particular.
I guess source control, prevention better than the cure.
Absolutely.
No, indeed. And so how's this going to then look like with all the potential changes we're seeing in the climate and future changes in urbanization and a lot of other aspects?
Absolutely. An increase in temperatures, etc., of waters. And that's something that cyanobacteria like it hot. There's a famously quoted paper in Nature once. But I think, the temperature is the key, but the physics stability as well is another. So, cyanobacteria has been one of my early things.
Yeah, I guess that progressed, and it progressed into much more broader topics.
But also always around cyanobacteria, because one of my first introduction to wastewater systems in lagoon systems or waste stabilization pond was actually through a project where I was asked to develop a treatment system using hydrogen peroxide treatment technology for some of these systems. And we did successfully. These are relatively controlled systems. And then we started looking at the sources and the causes. And then from there, trying to understand the system better. So cyanobacteria is always somewhere. And is always in the way or part of the dynamic.
Yeah, we always have that one element in our research that sticks with us.
Absolutely.
For me, it's that blue-green infrastructure element or the modeling, depending.
Yeah, as the old saying goes, be careful what you get remembered for.
Ah, yes.
Or known for, because people will ask you all the time.
I think one thing people will always remember you for, especially during the times of the Cooperative Research Center, was for program E and F.
Yeah,
we had
entertainment
and fun.
For
the listeners, there were 4 programs, A, B, C, D. We never had E and F, but Anas was always responsible for that, which I think really brought people together as well.
And I think people think about it as a more like side kind of, hassle in a sense, but it's actually phenomenally important. I say to people, one of the key things about doing research is that it has to be fun.
Indeed.
Because people can choose to study what they want. They can choose to work with whoever they want. But people will gravitate to research projects, even if they are hard and complex, where they are actually getting enjoyment from what they are doing. In fact, there is something about the pleasure of finding things out, as one of my famous books by Richard Feynman that I like reading and has been inspiring for my teaching is this series of interviews with the BBC called The Pleasure of Finding Out Things.
Oh, interesting.
And, if you see one of the videos of Richard Feynman when he's talking about how the world works, you can see his face light up and the smile comes because, this is the beauty. When you talk about something you're passionate about and you look at students or people listening to you and their eyes suddenly open up, you go like, that's the pleasure that we are all looking for. So any project, people sometimes take themselves a little bit too seriously. So my approach is make it fun, because that's an ingredient. It has to be the best science. It has to be the top research, but it has to be fun as well. I don't say it could be fun, but it has to be fun because it's part of it.
And that's where the storytelling also comes back in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. One of the workshops that we facilitated once was about how do you use metaphors to promote your research. And it's fascinating how words and how you turn people's imagination from one thing to the other through the metaphor is so powerful. That's why there are lots of politicians who may use their ability to speak metaphorically to reach more people than others who have a little bit more of a drier approach to knowledge, I suppose.
I find the visual hook is what gets people then to listen to you more.
Yeah, absolutely.
If it's relatable, then immediately it's comprehensible.
Absolutely. And again, it goes back to this saying about people wouldn't listen to you except if you make them. well, then why would people listen? I think that's one of the things. And it's really important. The hook is the element. Then they will listen and they continue listening, because start listening, you can lose people's attention also very quickly. So this is something that comedians know very well, because they know how to deliver things in a short way and captivating, but they keep some elements for people to look for. And I think that's one of the secrets of our trade, is that we communicate and we keep people connected and interested if we know what interests them as well.
True. They know how not to ramble, which I think is very common for researchers if we're not confident in the story that we're trying to tell.
Yeah. It's really fascinating. I had a group of high school students come to spend like some sort of program, vacation work, so to speak. There's a few of them. I think there's more than 10. And we kind of entertain them over a week, and we show them around and we show them labs and help them into something. We let them try things, etc., like the things you do with high school interested students. But I think we left one thing up to them. We said, there is a program, but we want you to document this week in the way you think will be the most impactful from your point of view.
Interesting.
Really interesting. Most of them did short videos of 30 seconds or a minute, and they were so impactful.
Wow.
So then I go to my colleagues, academics, and I go like, how about you distill your 45-minute lecture in 30 seconds? Go. And there is literally this inability. It's like almost a different language. That someone distills a week in 30 seconds or 1 minute, yet they're giving you the highlight, they're giving you the emotion, they're giving you all what they got through it is phenomenal. So I think this generation that knows how to use all sorts of media is doing something amazing in terms of synthesis and understanding. And then we, stand there sometime in front of them and ramble for hours, and they go like, what are you on about?
You could have said this in 5 minutes or 10 seconds.
So that, obviously, there's always some we need to develop. But think about that 30 seconds being your hook. And I think, how do you come about it? There's lots of thinking that goes into it. It's the old saying about, I apologize for the length of this letter. I like the time to make it shorter. That's what Blaise Pascal apparently said once.
Oh, really?
And, and sometimes when you go to students and say, make this assignment a one-pager, they struggle because they can give you 10 pages easily. But if you make it 1 page, it's harder. Now I make students make videos of 2 minutes. Make a business case for something, but give me a video of 2 minutes.
Less is more in this age where it seems like the attention spans are getting shorter and shorter.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's that ability to synthesize the information and understand your audience is really, really fun.
Yeah. But I guess you have to cater it for different audiences as well.
Exactly right.
And this means you might have different 2-minute videos for different audiences.
Exactly right.
But you are also quite active on Instagram.
Oh, yeah?
I've noticed. At least I always see, I think I've been tracking you and following you over the last few years purely from your Instagram.
Yeah. And it's really, again, it's because, this is sort of reverse mentoring. So this media that students interact with and engage with, I kind of looked for ways that I can use those to communicate with my students. So, for example, if I'm giving a lecture next week, then I will record a short teaser, and that teaser will go on Instagram, and it will go on LinkedIn, and it will go on whatever other platform, and students engage with it. So it's a way of keeping that connection. It's a way of saying, this is what's happening. This is what I'm thinking about. This is what we're going to talk about next week. Obviously, I make it lighter, make it more relatable. There may be some topic of the day. There's no shortage of relatable topics or events or things that happen that you can actually draw the attention to. And students respond really, really well to some of these things. So you can do the other way of saying, here's 10 pages. Everyone reads this before the lecture. We know it doesn't work.
It doesn't, no.
We give even assigned reading to committees and people working, and rarely people read these things. So how do you make it more relatable, more accessible, is by using some of these new techniques
that people are familiar with.
Yeah, and I'm having lots of fun because it kind of pushes pushes me into new territories.
That is true.
Yeah.
I actually saw one picture, I think one of the last ones you posted on your Instagram is of you standing in water holding up one of those protest things,
Correct.
but it was for World Water Day.
Correct.
And it was highlighting your favorite sustainable development goals from the UN.
Yeah.
And you're a big advocate of the SDGs. And in one of your TED Talks, you make it very clear we have 17 ways to change the world.
Absolutely.
We don't do them in isolation, but, it's definitely 17 different ways that are very and vastly different from each other. And you've since taken that on board. I guess your SDG mainly sits within 6, I guess 14 as well.
Yeah. What I like about that framework is that actually almost what I like about it is what some people don't like about it. And I think personally, it is broad enough for me to include all sorts of subjects in it. And when you look at the detail and how it's organized, it's actually allowing for that inclusivity, even of the things that we don't know today. So that's why it has gained some traction. I use it actually to frame my teaching, regardless of the subject that I'm doing, because I think it's really relevant, especially because students most of the time ask us this question: why does what I'm learning matter? This is something that's what I told you about, how I think always about what's on people's mind. So students always, when you hit them with something, they go like, why do I learn this? Why should I learn this? I feel that we have to always create a connection for them and answer that question all the time. In the long run, I say to students, if you only did take a unit or a subject, that's fun. That's possible. You can get a grade and all of that. But can you do more? Can you think about something much bigger? And maybe in 2 years' time, how you can set some expectations and then use this unit as a sort of a platform for the next. And it does really work very well because students see that greater connection to something that's much bigger, that's more into the future. Most of our students are concerned about the state of the world, regardless of where their political views are. And they will say, I want to do something about the world. So I go like, well, here you go. There's 17 ways. Just pick one. The minimum you can do is talk about it with someone over dinner. And I think that's what I liked about this program and this framework.
I think it's a very clear framework that allows you to then also see how you connect with a lot of the other disciplines.
Absolutely.
I sit in 11, so sustainable cities and communities, and I sit in 6, water, the main water one. We'll get the exact list in the show notes for this episode as well, so people can look it up. I think it's a nice hook, as you say, for people to get involved.
Yeah.
But that connection, it really shows that the water itself really links to a lot of other aspects. In your case, you've also seen the cyanobacteria always come back in your life. So water sustains life and water sustains happiness. That's, I guess, directly quoting from your TED Talk.
100%. Yeah. I think it's also what I learned from exploring other areas and being more open to multidisciplinarity over the years, that I realized that actually the technical aspects of water are not the big barrier. And the most problematic thing that we have with water is really access as such, globally speaking. And access is facilitated by people. So water is a people's problem. It's not really a technical problem because we can do anything today. I mean, where we're sitting in Perth today, we have 80% of our water come from desalination. 20 years ago, it wasn't. It was from rainwater. So we can take beautiful water from the ocean, turn it in, and at really reasonable costs. So we can do anything, really, technically. But then it is about what people want. It is about the vision. It is about facilitating solutions that are not traditional. And what I've been doing, in fact, lots of people refer to me as the urban water diplomat because I've been doing mostly diplomacy around water, telling people, look, don't worry. We've got your back as far as the technical is concerned. And I think people need that assurance. People need to understand that that solution stands up technically. But at the same time, I help people open their mind about alternatives and about ideas and about local solutions. And we've been having lots of fun involving all sorts of discipline, all sorts of groups. I'm running at the moment a program called Waterways Western Australia, which is really about developing a shared vision for the waterways in Western Australia as a fundamental pillar of prosperity of the state. Now, that's a big statement, but you can't do anything without water, but you can't do anything without connecting all parts of the water cycle to the traditional knowledge, to the cultural components of the water, to the social component of the water, to the economic component of the water. You can't just make it into an engineering problem.
You need the holistic approach.
You need the holistic approach. And for that to happen, you need to bring people together so that they can see that there is something in it for them. And that's really, as opposed to say, oh, we've got this agency looking after a river, so their job is to clean the river. Well, actually, it's not just one agency's job to clean the river. It's everyone's role. Bit like safety.
Yeah.
Safety isn't just the safety group that looks after it. It's everyone's job. So, everyone has to do something. Everyone has to have some sort of responsibility to that system and act on that responsibility. And of course, you have to have structures. So, yeah.
But I guess, at the moment when you have so many moving parts, so many players, how do you coordinate it? How do you, figure out a governance structure around it? How do you respect all the different cultural aspects? And I guess in this particular case, there's also indigenous cultures that are at play here as well.
And how do you bring them together also is different from this side to the other side, from this city to the other city. So for a long time, people would maybe think that solutions are a bit like a computer. You can just buy it off the shelf. Well, it doesn't work that way, because everything that happens, even with regards to your area of interest around green infrastructure, etc., not all green infrastructure is alike. There's always this human dimension to how people are connected to a forest or a system or whatever. And we need to build on that local knowledge. And that local knowledge goes as far as 80,000 years in Australia. So we need to reconcile those systems of knowledge and use them to the best of our ability to develop solutions that's beyond for the next 80,000 years.
Definitely. And it aligns well with, when we think of ecosystem services in cities.
Absolutely.
There is that cultural element, which we need to also leverage and capitalize on.
We have, it's not new that people acknowledge components, acknowledge the multidisciplinarity of a problem like water or energy or safety or security or whatever. These are like big conversations, big societal issues. But acknowledging that something is controlled by multiple variables and actually bringing that knowledge together to design solutions is not that easy. And as such, people haven't done it well. They would acknowledge that water is a social science problem, but they would just do things in isolation and wouldn't really, how do you change the way people think about water? It's not that easy. And what we're doing is just over-engineer solutions, just make the pipes bigger. In the meantime, we're still lacking better understanding of what water means to us as society, as opposed to just an allocation or a bill or just paying, because it's more than that.
But that in itself is already, I guess, a first problem to deal with. I guess a quote from the TED Talk you gave, you began with this idea of water literacy.
Yeah.
The general understanding or the general knowledge around water, which from basic Australian data, you could assume that the average literacy was around 10 to 20% around the world, which is not exactly high for an understanding of where the water comes from.
It means that people's understanding of water is very poor. But then when you go to different dimension, so those are based on like, where does your water come from? But if you dig deeper a little bit and say to people, well, give me an example of a place that has water that you remember from when you were a child, and you will find that people have some connection to a waterway, but then they don't think about it in the same way they think about the tap. So one is a service, the other one is a component of the history or emotional, and they don't make the connection. So the moment you make that connection, or for people whose connection, like traditional owners of Western Australia or all around Australia, have strong connection to the waterway. So their stories are around the waterways, and it has been part of their culture. So in a sense, there are a number of cultures that made that connection more visible, and as such, you have much more respect for the waterway and a much better understanding. So I do believe that when people make the connection and that journey that the world is going to be a better place, as opposed to expecting that the state will always give you the water that you need. And then if you double in population, well, we double the needs. But it doesn't work that way because, there's a finite component to water.
I guess we need more influencers who can do 30-second videos
Absolutely.
On water itself.
And we need to cross bridges and to talk to people about solutions. And people need to be more open-minded about small solutions, because I think the future is about people, local government, and even people in their houses taking decisions about these things. I mean, like smart houses these days, we think of smart houses as houses that are equipped with electronics and things, but you can think of smart houses in the future as being self-contained as far as producing water, producing energy, all of that. And that's really, really possible. There are people who are already doing that. So I think that taking that as part of looking into the future, that solutions in the next many hundreds of years shouldn't be the same as the ones from the past.
No, definitely. I think we can learn from the history, but just doing more of the same is not going to really solve the problem.
No, absolutely. Because we do have this imperative that, population are growing, cities are getting bigger as well, faster, and we have to do things better with less energy expenditure. I mean, when you think about Western Australia alone, there's more than 50,000 kilometers of pipeline to take water. So Western Australia, state of Western Australia is very large. And then there's pipes everywhere. So that's like going around the equator, 1.5 almost. That's huge. And because everyone are expecting that when they open the shower in the morning, it flows. And it's magical that it does every day. Now, if you double the amount of pipeline, the expenditure in terms of energy is going to increase hugely. And you can't just keep on over-engineer it.
I mean, just to illustrate for the listeners a size comparison, I mean, Australia normally looks quite small on the map, but that's only because of the projection used. Yeah. But I flew into Perth from Sydney. That's practically crossing the continent.
Absolutely.
And it took about 5 hours. Yeah. So think of a 5-hour flight. I'm just trying to relate it. It's the same as crossing North America. It's crossing the United States.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's roughly around the same order of magnitude. So, and Western Australia itself is massive. It occupies almost more than a third of the country, or third-ish, roughly. So,
and when you think about supply of energy and power and water, it's just phenomenal.
No, definitely.
Also challenging into the future. So if we keep just multiplying things, it doesn't work. So urban sprawl is not going to continue.
No, definitely not. Yeah. But in a way, we need transformative changes. We also need, in a way, the champions or the people that can influence that change. You yourself have made several different pathways into that. We've talked about Instagram, but you've also had a podcast at some point.
Yeah. Well, the podcast idea came also, it's all connected because I'm a university professor, so I work a lot with students. And the idea of podcast came from a student who says, you should start a podcast. I remember Sarah told me, she's now in the US. And I was like, oh, what is even a podcast? And we started exploring. And I think we just did it as a way of sort of, entertaining a class. We were teaching at the time wastewater. But again, it's all around this idea of I work in a system where I see my job as being someone who develops ideas constantly. So if I'm in my office in an afternoon, I'm thinking about something, I usually come out of my office and then the first person that I see. So sometimes it happens, most of the time it happens to be Leah, who is my co-conspirator in these kind of things. And I say to Leah, about this thing and this thing and this other thing. And she looks at me usually and go like, what are you on about? And that's how it came from. So the pun around water is that, usually my idea is not even formed, but I'm here sharing it. And I go like, I know in my head, it makes sense, but I just didn't say it properly. So that's how we started talking about it. And in our podcast is really about unusual stories about water. So there's a link between things like how do you link vodka, cod fisheries, and the Titanic. And lots of people who wouldn't see the link, but if you listen, you will find the link.
Actually, I think I do remember that particular episode because as soon as I saw it, I was like, this is strange. But for the listeners, we'll put a link in the show notes, but it's called What Are You On About? So Water You On About. Do you plan to do more episodes?
That's the goal. That's the goal. Maybe this is going to stimulate me, but we've just been lazy. There's so many things, but we're like, lots of our listeners are calling for more episodes. I think they are sick of just listening to the same episode or sharing the same episode. But, obviously we had COVID, so we were doing all sorts of other things. But I think, look, I'm looking forward to thinking about new episodes. Yeah, I have a whole list.
I would love to hear more as well. So if we ever need to pass on ideas, I'm sure we can share some.
I think it's also fascinating. We're talking about people, different generation having different. So I come from generation where I used to listen to interviews late at night to go to bed in the radio. That's how I grew up. Okay. So I'll tune in to BBC or French radio or Moroccan radio or whatever. They're usually interviews with like philosophers or whatever, usually late at night. This new generation students talk a lot about podcasts. I didn't see it coming actually, because it's a return of something that was so popular.
Yep.
Because suddenly like radio has become a little bit more, I suppose, commercial. But those things where people used to go to the radio for knowledge has kind of disappeared. Right?
Yeah.
So podcast has filled that beautifully, because there's like a podcast about all sorts of interesting things and you can choose when to listen. And that's beautiful. And lots of students actually learn via podcasts. Like if you ask students what their favorite show, it's probably likely is going to be podcast. Now, when I started teaching 20 years ago, it wasn't the case.
No. And you had more day-to-day radio shows about different topics that were current events. About certain celebrities.
Yeah, correct.
Maybe a science channel here and there.
Yeah. And also science making it a little bit, again, too formal. When the podcast is all about storytelling.
Yeah.
And I think that's fascinating, because people are willing to take the public transport and listen to a podcast, or drive, do their commute and listen to a podcast, or even share a podcast, or learn something about a topic that they've never heard of. So I think it's really fascinating. And that's amazing, because people think of these things are new, but they aren't, because we live in like sort of cycles.
Yeah.
So I was talking about Richard Feynman. One of his famous books is actually a compilation of his interviews with the BBC.
It's funny how this media is now enjoying a resurgence in the community, and it's great.
Yeah.
I've learned a lot from podcasts too, including how to do a podcast. So very, very grateful to the shows that have taught me. So I've been hinting at this for quite some time, but I do want to finally get back to it. And this is really that one famous TED Talk that you did, because you basically began with this topic of chocolate.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I've already given away the episode, like Wastewater for Chocolates, episode number 5. You can check it out. Sure. But had I known, I might have saved that exact title for you.
Yeah.
But it's really about the water footprint.
Yeah.
Where you call yourself a water nerd, and you've kind of described it why. And it's quite fascinating to me.
It's really interesting. I tell you where it came about. It was almost like a personal journey. This is the story that I didn't tell many people. But when I was approached for the TEDx talk, obviously the process is that you have like a curator and a coach, and then you work on the idea. And I approached it like I've given hundreds of talks all around. So you can wake me up at 3 a.m. and I can give you a talk about the technical stuff. And it's so easy for me, right? Because I know my topic and, But then when I started preparing for the TED Talk, and I was confronted with this idea that, oh my God, I'm talking to people about mostly a topic that tends to bring bad news, because most issues around water is lack of access, or people are dying, it's the end of the world, and all of that. And I go like, how can you go and start talking about such a depressing topic in a depressing way? And I go like, how can we talk about water in a more relatable way? So I did the thing that everyone does, which is watch all your TED Talks that you like, and you spend a night without sleeping thinking, oh my God, I am so irrelevant, because how can I be as good as this person or that person? So I panicked. I actually almost pulled out last minute. I've written my script and all of that, and I had this moment of panic 2 weeks.
For a great storyteller like yourself, I mean, that's
I know. It was really confronting, to be honest. But at the same time, that was probably the thing that unlocked the next level of storytelling for me.
Okay.
Is that I just wanted to... develop new ways of connecting with people, any people, all the people. Now you walk into a stage and you look up and there's 2,000 people. And then you go like, oh my God, I only have 5 seconds to get that connection. And it's really interesting because, you do the rehearsals and whatever, but it all depends on people, because for me, I'm a very interactive person. So I stood on that red dot and I said to everyone, hello, how are you? And then everyone responded back. And that was the starting moment for me. I felt like on a cloud. And actually, even the organizers turned the lights up because they knew that I am going to look into people's eyes and talk to people. And that was really the moment, I think, that kind of turned the dial for me in terms of how to connect to people. Now, I do connect to people through food because I'm also a foodie. So I go like, it has to be about food because food is water and water is food. And then when I started looking at how much it requires for water, how much water is required for an apple, etc. But then there was a shock when I discovered chocolate was like the highest demand in terms of water. So that kind of resonates a lot with people. The second topic that I'm passionate about is like food waste, which is like we use 70% of the water in the world to produce food. And we waste half of the food. And you go like, it doesn't make sense. And I come from also a tradition of no waste in terms of food. Like, it's very, very bad to waste food for me. It's like, why? So this idea of finishing your plate is almost a spiritual thing. It's like, why would you? When I look at some people who say, I don't like cauliflower. And they go like, someone nurtured that for like, months and produce a beautiful cauliflower for you to say I don't like cauliflower and throw it away. It's ridiculous. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I can relate.
I can make cauliflower taste very good. And I think that's one of my favorite things, by the way. But I'll give you just an example. I'm just picking on the cauliflower because there are lots of people who snob food because they don't know how food should be eaten or they haven't been introduced to the right way. And exploring different ways of eating makes you less wasteful, make you more connected to cultures, etc. And I think as humans, if you can't connect through food, you can go to a country where you don't know the language, but people will present you with food. And the rituals that humans have around food are so embedded in our humanity, beyond language, beyond culture, beyond belief, beyond everything.
So. And I mean, I love cauliflower and broccoli, actually. The two things that maybe many don't like, but I love them. So that they are my favorite vegetables.
Yeah, maybe eggplants. Eggplants is another one that lots of people don't like.
I'll eat it.
But I love eggplant too. So I can change you to eating eggplants if you are not. But I know you like eggplants because I think one of the dishes we had is an eggplant dish.
I mean, definitely. Depends on how it's made.
Yeah,
but I guess it's also a good opportunity to call out someone we've had on the show before, Professor Anna Delitic. In case she's listening, I'm still waiting for that cookout that we promised. That you and Anas were going to have a bit of a cookout.
It's going to happen. I'm pretty sure. We've never had the chance because she's very busy, and but we will do that.
Maybe we'll fly you in. So listeners, pass on the word. If we get a good amount of people, maybe we can fly people in for a special event.
That would be fantastic.
And then you can do the cookout.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, but just to illustrate, I guess we won't spoil too much of this TED Talk. I think I can highly recommend you to go watch it because it sheds light on just how much water goes into consuming things.
Yeah.
Chocolate being the most water intense out of the examples that you provided.
We're not saying to people not to stop eating chocolate, though.
No, definitely not.
So chocolate o'clock for me is around 4:00 in the afternoon when I'm in my office and I'm trying to finish up things.
There's a time for that?
Dark piece of chocolate. To me, that's when it's important.
Okay.
I grew up actually, it's funny because in Morocco we have like following the French culture, we call it le 4:00 is your like afternoon tea.
Le 4:00.
Le 4:00, so le 4 heures. So it's called that.
Yeah.
And usually in Morocco, it's like a piece of bread with a nice piece of chocolate inside. It's a sandwich. It's a chocolate sandwich. It's one of the most amazing things. You should try it.
Okay, I'll definitely have
a piece of bread with a nice block of chocolate inside it.
I know you like
It's
85%. Maybe it's a bit too strong for me, but I'll go for
I
something.
like dark. For me, it's dark. And I just think that it's amazing. But for me, when I reflect on how much water went into that, it makes that chocolate taste so good.
I definitely have to try that. It's a very interesting thing. It's not a spread. It's actual physical chocolate.
Actually, it has to, like, you break the block while biting, and it mixes with the bread. And then later on, the French patisserie make a pain au chocolat, which is literally means a bread with chocolate. So they made it into a fancy thing. But everyone around the Mediterranean knows that you take your favorite bread, whether it's a baguette or a flat bread or whatever, and you put a piece of chocolate, and it's the best thing ever that you have at 4 o'clock after school.
Okay, I will definitely look
and
that
it's
up.
called the 4 o'clock. That's why my
Le
chocolate o'clock. Le quatre. That's why my chocolate o'clock is 4 o'clock.
Perfect.
Until this day.
Let's just try and introduce that kind of habit in my lifestyle.
That's right.
So what does the future hold for you? Where to next? You're really going from some focused area around cyanobacteria. I don't know if they really hang around your chocolate nowadays, but you're really going more into that broader, holistic, engaging a lot of people.
Yeah. So look, with time, what happens is as you progress, people ask of you different things that you want to do as well. And then you see how, I've kind of made my mark more in bringing people together. So beyond the knowledge, it is about ways that we can work together. And it is still the most challenging thing for humanity, is to bring people together around shared vision about the things that they care about the most, because either people are too busy doing their latest project or too focused on their own idea or whatever. So it is almost sometimes a luxury to be able to bring people together. So every time that I have the chance and the opportunity to do that, I do that willingly, and I'm happy to do more of it because I think that's my area of impact, so to speak. I still enjoy going to the lab. Although when I walk into a lab, my students usually go like, let's get him out of here as soon as possible because, you don't want to mess with people's experiments are. But I've done lots of lab work. I've done lots of field work. I love being on site. But for me, it's about people and it's about storytelling. So how can we work together to achieve some goals that are meaningful to everyone, not just to scientists or not just to operators, not just to politicians, not to everyone.
I definitely look forward to telling stories together at some point as well. We should definitely collaborate on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's a challenging situation. But if you had a magic wand, if there's one thing you could change about the current situation, what would that be and why?
I would shift all the funding, for example, to be highly collaborative and highly outcome focused around bringing people together. Funding is really key because when you have the chance to, not every day that people come to you to offer you work or opportunity to collaborate more. It's often valued, but it's not really as it should be. So I think collaborative solution is really one of those challenges.
Yeah, and you've mentioned the Feynman interviews just now, but what other key moments, papers, books, or people have completely changed the course of your career and mindset?
Oh, many. I've told you a couple, but I'm passionate about being an educator. And it's really interesting because for me, the moment I was senior PhD students, I had quite a reputation as being an okay teacher at the time when I was. And there was one Friday afternoon where I got a phone call, got summoned literally to the head of department's office. Now, for people who know how universities work, when you get summoned to the head of department office is not always a good news. It's either bad news or very good news, but generally speaking, it was bad news. I didn't know what it was because you can do your career without knowing who even the head of department is as a PhD student. So then I walked in and this person says, hey, Professor XY, I remember at the time, has some health issues and they were basically taken to hospital and you're teaching on Monday. It was Friday.
Oh, wow.
It was a very panicky moment. So I was like, okay, thank you for the confidence. But he didn't even give me the option to say yes or no. So then I ran. It was really interesting because my long story with collaborative learning, I ran to the library. At the time, Google wasn't a thing. You could Google like how to become a teacher. And this person was really an amazing teacher who was like so influential, etc. So I basically got the top job without asking for it in terms of teaching gig. So I walked and I could only find a book that says Leaving the Lectern. That's the title of the book, Leaving the Lectern.
Leaving the Lectern.
And it was a model. I can send you the link. It was a model book about collaborative learning.
We'll definitely put a link in the show notes.
And I was like, this is very interesting. And the whole point was about how do you engage people in learning. And it has been now more than 20 years. This is really my approach. It's about engaging, it's about co-designing content. More than co-designing, it's actually creating content together. And that's where it started because I was thrown in deep end on a Monday. And, I had to run and do things. And I'm sure lots of people will find that they have some relatable stories. You never plan where you go. And I have been so passionate about learning together with others. I don't call it teaching anymore. I think it's just that opportunity and that privilege to get together with people and learn, because I think learning is such a social activity. People like to get together and learn, but when we make it into like activities that are either energy demanding or not as engaging, then people find it really tiring. And that's where sometimes we have difficulties in engaging young mind.
I think, again, to go back to the Feynman technique, in a way, one of the effective ways of learning is to teach it.
Yeah.
And in a social circle, you have that opportunity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the best way to learn something is to teach it to others or to learn it together, I would say, because, that notion of teaching. And again, my cultural experience and again, growing up in Morocco with all this storytelling, I've never perceived the people who were telling stories around me as wanting to put themselves in an authoritarian position of being a teacher, but more of a part of a conversation. And to me, that was really fascinating how someone can do that. Later on, I discovered that lots of the people that I grew up around were like superstar scholars, but it didn't appear to me at the time because they were not acting in a way that makes them speak at people. Rather, they were engaging everyone. They were engaging people of different ages, including myself.
Yeah. The ones that are often the most inconspicuous are often the most effective as well.
Absolutely.
It means they're deeply embedded with you.
Yeah. And how do you communicate sort of the passion of learning things? That's the most effective. And that's why I like the field so much. And I like to be on site because you see things, you understand how the world works. Because I think one of the things that humans have in mind is to look at the world and try to understand how it works. And then sometimes we just take the human mind and make it a little bit too busy with things that we want to be busy with, which is finances and things. And that takes us away from the pleasure of discovering how the world works. But I have no doubt that every human being is interested in how the world works around them, because I think that's part of us.
I think it's the curiosity of growing up, and we're always still growing.
Yeah, absolutely. And basically, sometimes we should just remind people of that. We should just help them be in a pathway towards discovery. So we're really extremely lucky at the university because people come to us wanting to be on that pathway. So that's the first step. It's not the only step, but the first step is wanting to be part of a pathway to discovering how the world works.
And you need to take it.
And to take it. And then to get the right pathway is our job, is to help them find that right environment. And I think it's really satisfying when you see it's just only natural, because most of our students at the university just need a little bit of help at the start. But after that, they basically fly on their own and they find their way. And that's the most beautiful thing.
They leave the nest, metaphorically speaking.
Absolutely. And that's the most beautiful thing to see. Like one of my favorite moments is when you see that you're working with a PhD student and they suddenly become a researcher.
Oh.
And you go like, wow. And that doesn't happen when they get their degree. It's actually usually often happens before. There is a moment where something happens and then that's it. And then they fly and you go like, job done.
With the students I've supervised, I've also noticed that moment, and it's a very proud moment.
Yeah.
I can definitely agree with that.
Yeah, it's fabulous.
So leaving the lectern, a book that got you out of a pretty tricky moment when you had no choice. But what was the most challenging situation you've ever faced in your career to date, and how did you overcome it? Was there anything more challenging?
Yeah, look, it's never one thing, but this is the thing with being in a position where you, at some stage, you develop and you become good at what you're doing, and you become very good at what you're doing. And then you're almost alone, because suddenly nobody really dares to tell you how to do your stuff. And then that's the risk. To me, there is a high risk of me stopping the learning process, because I learn every day. And then my biggest fear, or my most challenging thought, is that, oh my God, what if I stopped learning? And that would be the decline. And to me, that's really stressful. So what I do every day is to ensure that I never stop learning by creating. I always have projects on the go. I always have about the learning aspects, about how to continue being an engaging teacher, engaging learner. I said I don't use the word teacher. So in my classes, there's no teacher or professor or whatever. Everyone is a learner. So we have problems and we solve them together. And I think I'm always looking for ways of making that exciting for me. So it's a bit of a selfish approach, but it does make sure that it's connected to others as well.
But I guess it's an ongoing challenge of fear management to ensure that it never becomes a fear that gets
Absolutely, because again, I could just walk into a classroom and teach any day. And then you go like, well, am I still enjoying it? It's a bit like, you can be a performer, you can be a songwriter. There comes a time where you go like, what is getting me excited? And you have success and you're like a superstar. And then what? It's the then what that's exciting. So you go like, well, I'm going to make it relevant. I'm going to be exciting. I'm going to be excited. And sometimes, again, at the university is a very funny place. People who are from universities will relate to this, listening to this podcast, is that when you become good at what you're doing, people give you other jobs and they say, how about you become this and I will give you less teaching, as if teaching was like a sort of a tax system. And I go like, why would you take the most fun thing away from me? Because teaching and research for me go hand in hand. It's like discovery, it's the learning, it's all of that. So I never take that. So I find myself very busy, but I do enjoy, because that's the part that keeps us grounded. People ask you questions and you go like, well, I need to understand how the human mind works and how we can tackle problems together. And that's constantly evolving. Like people who tell you that the world think in the same way is not true. We never think in the same way. Every day is a new way of thinking.
Very true.
We probably have to say the keyword ChatGPT. But look at it. I mean, it was predictable. Lots of people have been talking about it for many years, but lots of people didn't really realize that it could come and become accessible so quickly and make huge changes to the way we learn. But again, humans are funny because they forget that there was a time where we didn't have the calculator, and then suddenly the calculator made. So then all the people who could do mental maths found themselves, you can do it faster now. And then there are computers and there's things, and, we're constantly evolving into some new things, and we're constantly finding ways of making the world a better place using some of these systems. And unfortunately, from time to time, we're also thinking of making the world a not so good place using same technologies. But generally speaking, the trend is to make the world a better place.
There's, I guess, always good intentions, but can be used and abused, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I guess looking forward to seeing where ChatGPT takes us now.
Oh, it's fascinating. I'm so excited about the opportunities and the headaches.
Is it true you use it for your emails?
Oh, yeah. Actually, the other day, I was like, first time I used it, I was like, I had this email that I was thinking about how to answer, like you have those emails and someone sends you something and they're asking you, but they're not asking you something.
Okay.
And you go like, I need to think about this one. It's not a straight yes or no email. So usually it takes me a week to answer those.
Oh, geez.
So I just said, I copied that email and I said, please reply to this email. And it wrote this most beautiful non-committal email reply that I was like, that's exactly what I was thinking. And I was like, Thank you. So, yeah, I like it because it's polite. So I'm feeling like I need to be short with someone in an email, then I don't do that.
When AI is polite, you might have to sometimes ask yourself questions because after all, it is artificial intelligence. I'm just making a reference to episode 5.
Oh, is it? All right.
Where we had some lengthy discussions about AI.
No, it's really fascinating. I think that's one of the examples. I could see lots of we are already using it. Like there's now platforms that will integrate it in our normal operation systems, and people will have time for other fun stuff.
That is true. I guess we have to use it to advantage, but also maintain that critical thinking that we've got.
I actually made it to write poems as well. I made, most famously, Leah's birthday was not long ago, and I just entered some characteristics about Leah, and I said, please write this poem. And it was, it got lots of attention.
Okay.
Yeah, it was really fun.
On the topic of ChatGPT and I guess, in a way, being more efficient, what tips and strategies can you offer in terms of time management? How do you maintain a balance between your professional and personal time?
Yeah, this is a really good question. It is always the challenge. But again, for me, the baseline is that program E and F, remember?
Yes.
It is all about fun. So how do you keep yourself engaged? For me, food and having food in my life and spending weekends exploring new ways of using ingredients, new foods all the time keeps me grounded, and also kind of takes away the dimension of pressure, all of that. So for me, it has to be food and people and nature. It's like that's the key to everything, because there is always something exciting about discovering a new ingredient that you can cook with, that someone decide that was gonna food. I mean, like, think about it. People were like early on, many years ago, they were just like looking at things and going like, that is food and that is not food. That's amazing. True. That is just like those decisions that were made early on. And you go like, what's the difference? What makes something food and something not food? And something food here may not be food there. We talked about people who don't like eggplants. Well, how did someone decide that eggplants was food?
In the first place.
In the first place. And you go like, wow, that's mind-blowing, right?
I guess there probably was a lot of trial and error and human instinct.
100%. But also how some recipes made it through a generation. So I was just watching this episode about, like we're recording this on Ramadan, and lots of people are now, by the way, best wishes to people celebrating Ramadan. Ramadan in the Muslim culture is a lot about family and getting together. There is a big, strong spiritual element to it. Someone did some research about all these foods that have been popular in Ramadan for hundreds of years, and apparently there are lots of similarities.
Okay.
Now, how do people keep food from one generation to the other for hundreds of years, literally? This is fascinating. Right.
It reminds me of the conversation I had with one of my other guests from episode 6, where we also discussed that there's not only a generational, but in this case, a cultural continuity across the world.
Yeah.
You can follow the trail of kebab across the different regions.
Yes. It's fascinating because it's almost like those things that some of the researchers will know this as well, that you think that sometime you came up with an idea, but every time you come up with an idea, there's probably 1,000 other people who are thinking of the same idea, because if you have the right ingredients for an idea, it will emerge. So in my view, there's no uniqueness to any idea, because people can come up with the same idea all the time. And then one person thought that meat could go into bread, and they did it in different ways. So when I hear people go like, this is the first time that the kebab has emerged, they go like, no, every culture has thought of pushing something into some form of bread. It's just not called kebab.
It's just what kind of meat, what kind of vegetable.
Yeah. And when and how you do it and all of that. And again, this is similarities. So when I retire one day, if I do, I will write a book about what people eat for breakfast. That's my book that nobody should write it. Because I think it's something about breakfast around the world.
That's true.
What people eat for breakfast is fascinating. Everywhere I go, I want to eat what the locals eat for breakfast, because that speaks a lot about their passion. Because like the breaking of the fast, we're talking about Ramadan, is also again that unifying thing, is that the body needs some kind of foods first. Now, how do people think about it? That's fascinating. You know, everywhere you go, like in Asia, people eat noodles, but the noodles for breakfast are different than the noodles for dinner or the noodle for lunch. So how does that work? You know, who thought of that? And it's really, really fascinating.
They say it's perhaps the most important meal of the day.
Absolutely. And there are certain things that people disqualified a long time ago from being a morning food, like a breakfast food. And I'm interested to find out why. Why do people wake up and line up for certain things for breakfast? Why do the French go and get the baguette fresh? Or the Germans? Because when I was in Germany, I was like, we had this trip that we were going to Denmark. And I was like, I'll just make some sandwiches. And my German colleague says, yeah, no problem. Yeah. I said, I've got some meats, etc., and some vegetables and whatever. I'll just go to the bakery the night before, buy some bread. And it was like, no. You can't use sandwiches from the night before. Oh. I will bring the bread in the morning. And I thought that was the first time that I realized that I did something terrible. So
that would have been sacrilege, right?
There will be totally, because he says, no. You have to have the britchkens and they have to be fresh. And I go like, and it's so beautiful that way.
And
so
it makes a difference. I tried them in Germany too. And
yeah. So people don't compromise about breakfast.
Okay. Being half German, I do compromise on it sometimes. But nevertheless, I mean, lots of passion for food. I guess in a way, food solves time management. It's kind of funny.
Absolutely.
But I think it really helps you then
ground yourself,
put you in a space that you know you can just do this for the next hour or so, several hours. But definitely nice advice to latch onto that passion.
Absolutely.
What advice can you offer to young scientists starting out?
Oh, follow your passion and have some fun, because, you know, there's so many great things and there's so many great people to work with. And to me, that was like the most enjoyable part of my life has always been doing research with the community that I've been working with just for many, many years, and being part of a global community as researchers are. It's just everywhere you go, you know people. And they know you and they knew you from when you were young. And sadly, some of my professors passed away. And then you could see how to reflect on those interactions, and the time that you build the community together is just phenomenal. I think that's what stays. I mean, papers and books and discoveries are almost secondary to the human element of research, in my view.
Indeed, programs, E&F.
Absolutely.
Sage advice. Anas, it's been fantastic to have you on, and I'd definitely love to do it again at some point, maybe on my next trip.
Yeah.
But where can people find you?
Well, I'm at the University of Western Australia. I'm on LinkedIn. I am on Instagram. Reach out if you have some ideas. If you come by Perth, come and visit. You know, always happy to make friends. It's really a big element of making friends is really about being a community building. To me, that's a big part of being a researcher.
No, definitely. No, thanks for that. And we'll have this and more information about all the topics we've covered today in the show notes for our listeners to
Thank
have
you
a look
so
at.
much.
But as I do with all the guests, one last message for the listeners to take away from today.
Oh, look, again, I'm so passionate about people, talking to people, working with people, enjoying the discovery and the journey. And I just hope that we learn more and more how to walk side by side, as humanity is sometimes experiencing some strange things. Wars is one of those things that I call strange, that affects everyone around them and beyond for generations. You know, people should think about walking together, walking side by side, not one in front of the other. We are in Australia talking about probably what will be a historic event of a vote for acknowledging voice to parliament in Australia. Such an overdue thing, and also an important symbol that Australia needs to send to the world, that we are ready to do the proper reconciliation and acknowledge traditional owners as they should. And I think that's really would be fabulous for the future. I think it will open up lots of opportunities for Australians and the world.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you to you, listeners, for tuning into this fascinating and mouth-watering conversation with Ghadouani. For guidance on how to open up your kitchen, or where to find more limnologists to give hugs to, or even use ChatGPT to answer your emails on a daily basis, check out the show notes over at peterandbach.com/podcast. If you enjoyed this show and are looking forward to more episodes, please do subscribe. Follow this podcast on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, or wherever you are listening from to be notified of the latest release as soon as it becomes available. Leave a review or pass this on to your friends and family to spread the beautiful messages from our many guests. If you're curious about me or my work in general, you can also check out my website or social media. Head to peterandbach.com, my YouTube channel Peter Marcus Bach, that's Marcus with a C, or follow me on Twitter at peterandbach or Instagram at peterandbach87. Thank you very much for all your support so far. If you have feedback or suggestions, or just know someone who has an inspiring story to offer, please feel free to reach out to me on social media. The podcast intro and outro song is called Breaking Sweat by Balloon Planet. Stay tuned for our next episode and next guest to hear how they are tackling the grand challenges.